everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Patti's People, sponsored by the Evidence Base. I'm Dr. Patti Peeples with the Peeples Collaborative, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Blythe Adamson to our stage today. Blythe, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a little overview of your illustrious career. You have spent time in consulting as a board member, as a founder of your own company, a professor, and an active parent who travels internationally. Can you summarize for our listeners a little bit about what's brought you to where you are here?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I would say it's really in the interest of helping populations of people all at once. Growing up for me, I thought about becoming a doctor, treating one individual person at a time. But what drew me was the allure of the scale of being able to have an impact at the intersection of science and math and health, being able to affect huge populations of people all at one time. And so that's why it's just been a delight for me to combine epidemiology, economics, data science, now machine learning, to be able to inform policy, decision-making. It's been a very fulfilling career.
I really identify with that. That is often very similar to what I describe as what brought me in. There's something so exciting about this career that does have that intersection of ethics to economics to health outcomes. It's just an incredibly varied career. And you've spent a lot of time in the AI field well before it was on most of our tongues. I have a question for you, though. What was your job in high school? And does that at all suggest where you were going to go in the beginnings of your career?
Oh, man. Well, in high school, I actually detailed cars and did electrical work. So I grew up in a poor rural Pacific Northwest environment on an oyster farm. I don't know if that has anything to do with what I do now, but I did volunteer with the local AIDS foundation. So for me, growing up and in high school, I was able to give bags of food to people who had AIDS and were really struggling to be able to pay for their drugs. And for me, it was eye-opening to see people physically deteriorating when life-saving and preserving medicines were available, yet out of their reach and access because of affordability. And so I think that many of those important relationships and HIV, even in my own family members, to me was motivated me to serve out of love.
That is a really thoughtful response. How does that experience that you had on the ground of seeing the end patient result of public health and public policy, how has that guided you in your overarching mission?
Well, there are so many lessons that we've learned from the HIV epidemic. I mean, that passion for me started very young, but I became an HIV researcher and pursued that. And eventually it led me back to working at the White House as the lead data scientist during COVID. But there were many lessons that we learned from accelerating the development of new medicines to treat HIV, creating new FDA pathways for approval because of the public health urgency to that we also saw during COVID with the Operation Warp Speed and development of vaccines for COVID. So for me, there's been so many connected lessons where I'm so grateful that different parts of my experience have been able to come together.
So let's pivot now to your job specifically at Flatiron. You've been responsible for overseeing Flatiron's relationships with international collaborators through Flatiron's FORUM, which stands for Fostering Oncology Real-World Evidence Uses and Methods. And through this, you're collaborating with a variety of global life sciences countries and companies. Your consortium's aim, as I read it, is to enable better decision-making through the use of RWE, specifically in oncology. Could you tell our listeners specifically what makes this collaboration forum unique, and with whom are you working, and what are your short and long-term goals?
Oh, well, this has just been such a delight to have a public-private partnership that's really a win-win-win from all of the different angles. And it's motivated, the research agenda really has been motivated by a shared dilemma around this topic of transportability of evidence across country borders. So what we had been hearing from governments with this dilemma of decision-making was, when we don't have local data available, when is it appropriate to turn outside of our country and look for other data sources to be able to inform the decisions we need to make now and learn from the experience of cancer patients outside of the country that we're trying to apply this evidence to. And for life science companies, this was incredibly important because the burden of generating the evidence was huge, and there just weren't always data sources available necessary to be able to show the safety, effectiveness, and value of new medicines when submitting to health technology assessment bodies across the world. And so together, being able to bring life science partners, government decision makers together, including many different perspectives and key opinion leaders. This is where we've been able to start pioneering these cutting edge benchmarking studies to show when is it possible to actually bring evidence across country borders.
Tell me a little more about these benchmarking studies. What might be the objective with that study, and how did you use that to inform a greater decision-making process?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe stepping back, the concept of generalizability first is, if you have a target population, let's say you in the UK, and you have a sample of patients from the UK, and you do a study based on those patients. Generalizability is, are the findings from those patients generalizable to the broader population from which those patients have been selected? And what's different about transportability is, if you pick patients from, for example, the United States, they're not generalizable. The generalizability would be to other patients in the United States, but transportability is, can you learn from them and make adjustments to be able to predict what you think the outcomes would be in another country? So a benchmarking study would be using the data to create empirical evidence of, for a specific disease area, for a specific combination of countries. Can we take the outcomes from one country, adjust them to the demographics and clinical context of another country, and accurately predict? So a benchmarking study would then compare that prediction to the true observed outcomes of patients in that country. And it's a measure that can give us confidence of, is it appropriate then to be turning outside country borders to make adjustments and apply it for decision making?
Now, HTA agencies have been laser focused on generalizability and a little more suspect, if you will, of transportability. How have you been able to move their decision making and acceptance of transportability based on this kind of research you're doing?
Well, first, I think it's breaking down the concepts into what these HTA agencies already intuitively know. So big domains of that might be, they know that outcomes depend on the demographics of a population. So, what's the performance status and age of the people included in a study? And those, I think people are pretty confident. We know that we can make adjustments for those between different populations. The second would be, what do the treatments look like that are used in that population? Are there huge differences in the market share, and distribution of what drugs are being used in one situation versus in another? And those can be selected and controlled for. if there's enough overlap between two different healthcare systems of what they recommend using. The third domain is unmeasured confounder risks of, are there differences between these healthcare systems that are different than the patient characteristics, different than what treatments, what are the other things like how long people stay in the hospital after surgery that may actually modify the effectiveness of the regimens. And so that's what these benchmarking studies are a great opportunity of testing for. So it's designing experiments to test for when are differences between two countries' healthcare systems big enough of a deal that it's not appropriate to be borrowing evidence from one to another.
So if the third was the unmeasured confounder risk, might I suggest that there could be a fourth, which would be unknown confounder risk? Have you become familiar with confounders that we should be paying attention to, that there's something in there that is limiting the transportability because we're either not measuring it or we just haven't considered it up to now?
Well, a unique dimension of that is hot new research coming out of Miguel Hernan's causal inference lab at Harvard, where his new team is replicating studies where they have one experimental design, but they're performing their experiments in a sequence of different countries. And what the contribution that they've recently learned is that the set of confounders, of even known confounders and unknown, is unique by country. So for example, in the United States, social determinants of health in the United States are probably meaningfully different than social determinants of health in Germany because of these healthcare systems. And I think that one of the best practices that they're now recommending is the enumeration of all the relationships that we think are happening in different countries. So the technical term would be like enumeration of those causal inference DAGs, to be able to make your best guess of all the things you think are related, even if many of them are not measurable. But Pat, your question about, what confounders do we not even know about? This is why the benchmarking experiments are helpful, because we can say, given what we can measure and what we do know about, here's our prediction of what an outcome would be, and comparing that then to the real outcomes that are observed. So it's a form of validation that allows us to figure out, are there unmeasured or unknown confounders that are so impactful that a study might be inappropriate to do.
And so to that end, are you envisioning eventually that there would be some sort of transportability confounder basket, if you will, sort of like the basket for the CPI, right? A basket of potential confounders if we're transporting from the US to the UK. Would that be specific to only an individual disease, such as one type of cancer, or do you think that it could be a bit more generalizable to beyond a singular cancer?
That's such a great question. And I love hearing the way you describe it as a basket of confounders. I think you're absolutely right. The basket of confounders will differ by disease area, probably, and even just being more broad than cancer. The basket of confounders we would expect would be different for diabetes evidence to be transportable across countries. And then within cancer, our team is enumerating what's the minimum set of things you do need to adjust for across different cancer types. And then what are the minimum things, the disease-specific cancer considerations that should also be adjusted for to be able to properly predict what you think the outcomes would be in another country.
So let's keep diving down on social determinants of health, and that almost feels a little bit narrow given where we've come from this transportability discussion. But It always strikes me, and it was particularly high in that little thing that was kind of niggling at me at ISPOR, based on some of the wonderful plenary sessions that were there. We talk a lot about social determinants of health, but why is this not just first and foremost in almost every bit of outcomes research that we do? Why are we still so reticent to put this as a predominant outcome variable?
Well, I absolutely agree with you that I think it should be part of more of the conversation. And maybe it's because HEOR researchers feel limited in what they can actually do to help resolve the situation and make things better. If the way that they're influencing decisions is related to value and pricing and market access, and, you know, if you're not a payer, or I think all of it's very complicated within the US fragmented healthcare payer system of how HEOR researchers can have an impact on it. One of the new studies that Flatiron just published a few months ago, so the investigator Harlan Patel and his team published in the Journal of Breast Cancer Research and Treatment, is about how social determinants of health, like racialized economic segregation, can even drive treatment and survival inequities in breast cancer. So it's really highlighting the need for public investment to address structural racism within the US healthcare system as part of the mechanism to improve outcomes. Yeah. And that kind of study, I'd say, absolutely, health outcomes researchers need to be part of that conversation, because it's part of saying, this is how much we should, as a country, be willing to invest in a policy in improving the structural racism at a level that it will achieve outcomes in this way. So rather than just using our skills to assess treatments, diagnostics, vaccines, the application of these methods to public health policy and investment, healthcare infrastructure and system are incredibly impactful. Yeah. At a global level, I think when we come together as communities of researchers at meetings like ISPOR, I think one of the challenges is that the social determinants of health are so different between our countries, that policies that may be inequities that we observe in the US may be completely different than in a country like Germany or the UK or France, where there's the barriers to access are completely different than they are in other countries. So yeah, that it's a stumbling block for us in working together.
Yeah, it's a significant one. It just, makes me recall sitting on an journal editorial boards. I mean, every manuscript that you read, of course, has the same limitations, that this is only representative of the sample of which it was conducted in. And it strikes me that, this is a bit of an aside, but it strikes me that as an industry, we're missing such an opportunity to make a public policy ask in that limitation, and to really be to be a niggle in the in the eyes of the government and of the electronic health records, that we are just not doing the basic work we need to do as a socially responsible nation by passing that off as just an oh by the by limitation.
Well, I would say the advantage we have now, and the skill set that's being underused in public policy, really is this intersection of health and economics. I mean, I really saw this when I was working at the White House, is that it's so important to be able to make a strong economic argument, because sometimes altruism, doing the right thing, is not enough. I think you have to be able to translate that and say, what if we did the right thing, and here's the economic impact? That even if you didn't care about health at all, here are the numbers of how it could affect, long-term GDP per capita or unemployment rates, or, gave us more, improved our national security. So to me, I love finding the intersection between finding something that does the right thing and optimizes things for the right reason, but then you can translate that into a strong economic argument where the numbers completely make sense as well.
Well, I'm so excited to see where our major association might be going with this public policy facing intent that I think the new CEO of ISPOR has. I think that is the right kind of conversation that we should be having. So. I saw recently that ISPOR released a suitability checklist for electronic health records for HTA, and it's to be used on data delineation and data fitness for purpose. I'd like to ask you to comment a little bit about this report. It touches on providing a guide to analysts about data characteristics, provenance, governance, reliability, and relevance. What can you tell us about this report, and what do you think it will accomplish?
Oh, this was a labor of love by the task force that developed this report. So I'm a member of the task force and contributed and worked with the team of task force members. We spent more than 3.5 years to working together. And one of the things I love about ISPOR task forces is in representing a society's position on something. One of the crucial requirements is having the composition of task force members represent all of the different perspectives that are incredibly important. So this has, task force members from government and the pharmaceutical industry, from tech, from consulting, representing patients, from NIH. So this was a group that we had the most fascinating conversations together, and really were able to combine together the empathy of all of these different perspectives. And what we came up with, and also it includes a review of all the different data quality checklists, real world evidence frameworks that have already been published by many different governments, Duke Margolis, all of the different ones that are out there. So first, it's a synthesis of information, which can make it easier so I recommend reading it just if you haven't had time to read all the 300-page documents that every government has ever published. This really combines together what are the common essential elements that an evidence generator needs to go through to be able to assess, is a data set suitable for analyzing to create evidence that is rigorous and trustworthy to be submitted to a government HTA to be able to make a decision about a new medicine. So it includes the domains that you've discussed, and really the checklist is meant to be an easy, practical tool that is able to synthesize information and hopefully really able to translate into being applied in the appendix of papers that are trying to make claims using EHR-derived data to create evidence for HTA. So in an appendix, filling out this checklist should be a great way to make it easier for peer reviewers and make it easier for HTA bodies to look at the completed checklist, sort of like the Cheers checklist in a way, to be able to say, okay, yes, this data set was the most suitable to fill the evidence gap that remained.
Mm-hmm. And were there regulatory members on this task force?
Yes.
So representing what? The FDA, NICE, that kind of individual?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Were there any patients on the task force?
I believe that we had patient advocacy representation.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting watching the progress of patient involvement as moving from patient advocacy intermediaries to hopefully in time actual patients serving in these decision-making roles. Do you see that happening at all on any task forces that you're engaged in where there's actual patients that are currently suffering from the disease or the challenge?
I am seeing ISPOR really encouraging this. I mean, we're also seeing this on plenary stages at conferences, creating the platform and being able to give patients an opportunity to offer their perspective and their voice, and this, to me, even in, I spent more than 15 years in HIV vaccine clinical trials. The patient advisory boards or community advisory boards were always an essential part of how we design clinical trials.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're beginning to see the adoption of that because it's been so valuable in clinical trials. Now in real world evidence generation, we're also continuing to see the momentum of patient engagement and involvement.
Let's turn to something that you spent about a decade really diving into, and I know it's a big component of your job here at Flatiron. Let's talk about the effectiveness of large language models in using databases with cancer. Tell us a little more about how Flatiron in general is using these tools to scale real-world evidence data curation.
Oh, well, I'll clarify and say we've been using large language models since they became available, not 10 years ago, but more recently. But for a very long time, Flatiron has been using deep learning models. So one of the advantages that we have, just kind of stepping back at Flatiron, is that because we have more than a decade of golden data labels that have come from all the labor of our expert oncology nurses and tumor registrars, opening up charts, finding hidden, really important information like, has this patient's disease progressed? Or looking through a 50-page PDF report of complex genomic testing results. What's the percent staining for this biomarker? Those were clinical details that actually mattered and changed the decision about what treatments are on. They affect what the outcomes are of patients who are receiving different treatments. But all those things have been hidden within a lot of documents, within the text and paragraphs of clinical notes. And a lot of the traditional analyses that many people have done with claims data or other structured data sources have lacked the clinical depth that's really found within documents and within text. And so Flatiron, through a paper that my team published, demonstrated how we develop deep learning models trained on all this oncology data and golden labels, and also validated with these expert labels. And then more recently now, we've been able to show, so we've just presented at ISPOR in Atlanta, our poster on LLMs used to extract PD-L1 biomarker testing results. So including, is it not just is it positive or negative, but pulling out the percent staining, and how this performed using 2 different LLMs and 0 shot. So if you just ask it to pull out the information versus our additional fine tuning based on more golden labeled data. And I would say that how this is changing the field in general and at Flatiron is through our ability to improve the speed and scale of accessing this type of clinical depth. So previously, through years and years of effort, Flatiron had curated more than 300,000 patients' records. But we've really been limited by our human capacity to open up charts and through and find this information. And it's really through this application of AI now that we've been able to much more quickly identify and extract the same information in clinical depth with same accuracy from now more than 4 million patients with cancer. So this really inspires me to, with the ability now to fulfill this vision of timely evidence, really real-time evidence at a much larger scale than Flatiron's had the capacity to learn from before.
What kind of metrics can you talk about in terms of the efficacy of this large language model approach compared to the human-powered approach?
Oh, well, you can refer to our poster from ISPOR to look at the specific measures of the positive predictive value, negative predictive value, sensitivity, and specificity. But it's very, very encouraging that we're able to get to the same levels of accuracy as we are with humans. And part of that comes from, there's also a great new paper on hybrid methods. So when you're able to combine both artificial intelligence and humans together. So a situation like that might be, let's say you want a variable and you apply AI to extract that information. You might have some extractions. For some patients, the model may be very certain that it accurately captured the information. And there might be another patient where there was some uncertainty around that. When you then triage that and send the uncertain value to a clinical expert to open up and confirm the charts, you can actually end up with information that is more accurate than if one person by themselves had gone through and extracted the information. So hybrids that have better performance compared to one person extracting that information alone. And it's only possible when you have access to all those source documents and you have an army of highly specialized, qualified oncology registrars, where you can have 2 or 3 of them duplicate the extraction of things to get the highest quality golden data to train and validate those models.
And so there's a lot of hype. The last couple of ISPORs I think have been filled with AI focused presentations, specifically around real world evidence. Where do you think our industry as a whole should dive deeper, should dig faster? Where do we need to focus?
Yeah. Well, one of the new documents to come out that I really like is the European Union's AI Act. And in this guidance document, it gives a risk-based framework where it says some applications of AI in health may have low or minimal risk, some medium, some high, and some will have just an unacceptable level of risk in their application. And my prediction for the future is that we'll see the fastest adoption of AI in the minimal to low risk applications first, and then there'll be a longer time to adoption of the highest risk use cases. So an example of a low risk use case might be how people have been applying them for systematic literature reviews, where all of it is using public information and it can just be checked by a human to see if it was all done correctly. Those can be low risk use cases where it can accelerate something, but the quality of it can be checked. A high risk use case may be applying AI directly at the point of care, in your doctor's office, where if you just completely disengaged the doctor completely and had the decision-making about what treatment a patient should receive be completely guided by ChatGPT at the point of care. So that's a high-risk use case where we're seeing the most regulatory involvement. So for example, FDA now having pretty strict guidance about using AI in clinical decision support tools, which is, exactly where regulation should be focused, which are at the higher risk use cases. So I think in research and healthcare, that's probably how we'll see the adoption progress. So it's the distinction of what category does your idea fall into in terms of risk of, would it harm a patient if it was wrong?
So give us a update of where the regulatory bodies and the HTA agency stand on the lowest risk scenarios, such as AI used in systematic literature review. Have they even opened the gate for the allowance of that?
They have. And where I'm also, I've spoken with, so I work with many governments. I've advised the Department of Defense in the US and in meeting with regulatory and HTA bodies. I'm even seeing them now question their own internal work and saying, where can we be applying LLMs within our own workflows to be able to help gain efficiencies in terms of our speed of reviews, because so many of these groups, have the amount of workload they have is just beyond capacity. And so in addition to having to make judgment determinations on the acceptability of evidence generated at some time in the research and development pathway assisted by AI, they're even asking themselves, how can we be incorporating AI into our systems to be able to not miss an opportunity to have some efficiency gains as well?
Really interesting. That certainly is a way to open the door for that, with talking about how they can individually benefit from this process.
Yeah, one other prediction I have on this. I think that there's another conversation also happening about living HTA.
Right.
Really means like updating dossiers more often, doing value assessments more often in real time. But that also comes at a huge amount of labor of updating all of that information. So I often hear in the conversation right now, can AI enable more living HTA, where once you've established, how to generate evidence for this, that AI can be of assistance in updating documents and information by incorporating all of the new evidence that's become available since the last time that drug was reviewed.
Is Flatiron engaging at all with CMS and other stakeholders on the Inflation Reduction Act?
So Flatiron has been involved in many of these conversations. And I think it's great that CMS has put a stake in the ground saying that how we understand the value of drugs is important and part of our nationally accepted conversation now. There's no more, there's not the death panels language that we had heard previously. And I've been really encouraged that CMS has incorporated into even their RFPs that have given more insight into how the analyses will be done on their side, that real world data is going to be used to help generate evidence to understand the data. So they have, not, I don't want to use the word admitted, but, accepted that after clinical trials, there are still gaps in evidence. Not all questions are answered, and lots more information about how well these drugs are performing in the real world, especially in that over 65 population. There's a great opportunity for them to fill in gaps in knowledge and update their assessments of how valuable a drug really is in the real world.
Let's move to our last section, which is always really fun. These are our rapid fire questions. So answer in one or a few words. The greatest near-term opportunity for real-world evidence that is currently untapped is?
Predicting how well a new medicine will perform in different countries.
Okay. What area should HEOR stop pouring resources into, and why?
This one is, as someone who's been on ISPOR acceptance panels, I'm tired of seeing AI for systematic literature reviews. It's done, it's tired, people accept them now. It's not novel anymore. So I would love to see many more creative applications of AI and LLMs than systematic literature reviews. So yeah, there are cooler things that I want to see next.
AI SLR no longer cool. You heard it here first. Useful, but not cool. Yeah. The problem that keeps me up at night is?
That many people are losing faith that it's possible to generate rigorous evidence from real patients' experiences. And just that many people have been burned and the reputation tarnished and trust broken from groups doing garbage studies with low quality data. So I worry that some people are losing faith.
Really? Tell me a little bit more about that. What are are there segments of stakeholders that are particularly losing faith? Was there a seminal event that really was the straw that broke the camel's back? Tell us more.
I think there's a great variability in the quality of real world evidence that's being produced by different groups, and whether it's they're using low quality data sets that are not fit for purpose, not suitable, don't have the clinical depth necessary for the decision context, or they're using dumb methods that are not accounting for all of the different factors. I mean, we all love using as simple methods as possible to answer the research question, but in the real world, to generate rigorous, high quality evidence often requires really sophisticated methodology that is not necessarily trained at all universities, that not everyone has access to be able to learn. And so I think whether or not they're using bad methods or bad data, there's just been, there is variability in the quality of evidence. And just as we learned what are the best practices for running a high quality clinical trial to develop trustworthy evidence, we all are trying to gain consensus over what are the necessary components for high quality real world evidence, so that you know when to trust real world evidence, just as you know if and when you can trust a clinical trial.
So it sounds like the suitability document can be the antidote for bad data and dumb methods.
Yes, that's why I spent those years pouring the volunteer hours into participating on this task force, because we need to solve this together.
Maybe you need to rename the document, "No more bad data, no more dumb methods." Here's how. If you had unlimited resources and no career or company affiliation restraints, what would you focus on solving in terms of the main problem in healthcare?
I would build, if I had an unlimited amount of money, and I mean, sometimes I think about this, what if I won the lottery or had some surprise inheritance where I became a billionaire, what would I do? I would absolutely build global real world public health data infrastructure. To create real-time insights, situational awareness, how well is every drug working, for who, at what time.
That would be freely accessible?
Absolutely. Yes. Well, if I had all the money in the world, I wouldn't need a business case for how it's going to generate revenue. You could just fully use it for public good.
Blythe, if we have this conversation in 5 years, what will we be discussing?
Let's say that 5 years from now, there is a lot more infrastructure for real-time access to EHR data in many different countries, and that everybody's using the great methods that are appropriate to answer research questions, and great data is available. I think our conversation is more going to be focused on how can we keep incorporating this into more elements of decision making. If governments are, really incorporating great real-time evidence into setting their clinical pathways, the conversation will probably move towards how can this also serve individual providers better when they have uncertainty in their decision making at the point of care. So that's where I see the direction we're moving.
And last, just off the cuff question, give me an example of how you've used AI in your personal non-work life.
Oh, I have a great example. So my best friend recently was invited to give the commencement speech at the Yale School of Public Health. And one of my daughters is a huge fan of the TV show Gilmore Girls, my 12-year-old, and where Rory goes to college at Yale. So I said, ChatGPT, give me a 3-hour walking tour of the Yale campus designed for a 12-year-old girl obsessed with Gilmore Girls that stops at highlights of places that the show filmed in. And so she and I just had the best day going through Yale, going to Rory's dorm, like all these fictional character scenes, but it was our way of touring the Yale campus. And then we ended the day at the Yale School of Public Health commencement ceremony, where we got to watch her hero, my friend, give an inspiring speech. So it helped us have a great day.
That is a brilliant example and a really heartwarming story. Thanks for sharing that. Well, Blythe, this has been just such a delight to sit down with you. You are so thoughtful, and I think you've got some really interesting foresight into where our industry is going. And I really, really appreciate the time that you've given us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. It was so much fun speaking with you.
Loved it too.